Closures are one of the important concept in JavaScript. In fact, it is one of the many questions that are normally asked as a part of technical interviews for JavaScript developer. So if you are also preparing for JavaScript interview, then this video is very important. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Nisha Singla, and in today's session we are going to talk about another important interview question in JavaScript, and that is closures. So without any further ado, let's get started. Closure is one of the topic that most of the people fear to learn or even don't understand it. But trust me, it is a very simple concept. You just need to understand it properly, and you need to understand where exactly you can use it. So just follow this session along with me, and at the end of the video you will be able to understand it properly. I will start with the basic example first so that I can show you where exactly closures we are using, and at the end of it we will take one real life example where we can see how you can use it in your projects. So you can open your any editor. I'm using some online JavaScript compiler. You can use any editor which you are using. To understand closure, you need to first understand with the concept of functions in JavaScript, how lexical scoping works in function. So before jumping directly to the closure, let me give you some bit of lexical scoping and how scope work in function. Suppose we have one variable here and we have a function test. So if I create any variable inside this function, then that variable is only accessible within this block, right? And if I try to do console.log a here, what output you will get? You can see we are getting 20. And the reason is very straightforward. When this will run, when test function will execute, it will create an execution context for this function. And when it will execute and try to find out the value of a, first it will try to find the value of a in its own context. So do you have a variable defined within this test function? Yes. So it prints 20. But if you try to print the same a variable outside this function, then in this case it will print 20 because 20 is on global scope. So it will find a from here. But if I say something like this, let me remove this one. At this point of time, what value of a you are expecting? As inside this test function, a is not there, right? So my test function is not able to find a in its own execution context. So now what it will do, it will try to find the value of a in its parent. So for test function, the parent is window object. So now it will go one hierarchy up and try to find out the value of a there, and it find a as value 10. So now when you run this one, you will see the value 10 will print. So this all is happening because of lexical scoping in JavaScript. So lexical scope describe how your child function have access to the variable defined in the parent scope. So for test, window is the parent scope. And this rule will go if you have nested function also. If inside this test function you create further function, the same testing will go like this. First, it always check in its own execution context. If it find the value there, that's fine. If it doesn't find, it will go to its parent to find out the value. And this checking will go up to it will not reach to the window object. This is the first thing you need to understand the closure, that how lexical scope works in JavaScript. Now let's take an example. Suppose I want to display a counter. With every function call, I want to increment the value of my counter by 1. So what approach you will do for that? So interviewer want to see how much you can think while writing your code. So if you will try something like this, okay, like I have a count variable and I will start it with 0. I may have a function that is the counter function, and I will say like console.log, and maybe I will say count plus 1. And if I call this function, you will see it will print 1. You can bind this function to some button also by adding some event, but I'm just printing it like this. If I call this function 3 times, you will notice 3 times my function is calling. So this way you can say I'm getting my counter, right? My counter is working fine. But wait, there is a problem with this code. Now try to focus on the code and try to observe like what problem this code may have. First thing you need to understand, like you should not put your variable on global scope or on window object. Try to avoid declaring variable on window object. The problem with the window object is that by mistake, if any another script has count variable, it may overwrite your variable, or accidentally your code can override by like this as well. If I say count equals to 20, so do you know what output you will get? Now you are going to get 21, 22, 23 because accidentally I have reinitialized my count variable to 20. This may break my complete code. So this approach is big no. You should not go with this way. So what's the second way you can get this result? Now you will think, okay, if global variable is not allowed, then I have only one choice. I will pick this statement. I will put it inside this function. That's all I can do, right? But do you think that you will get the result now? Try to execute this function. Every time when you execute this function, this statement will also execute. This will lead to reset my count every time to 0. So every time when it reset to 0, it will print 1. So this will also not work, right? So now we understood like these statements are not working. So how you can get the result? So the solution of that problem is closure. So now let me first explain you the definition and then I will come to this demo. So you just need to prepare with one definition because in interview when they ask you what is closure, first of all you need to explain them theoretically, right? So you should have some well written definition in your mind like what is closure. So in JavaScript, closure basically is a function that references the variable in the outer scope from its inner scope. Or you can say closure is basically a function when you create another function from your function and your inner function has access to all the data of your outer function or your parent function even after your outer function is completed or it is done with its execution. That is called closure. So closure is somehow related to manage your state of your parent function. So how we can achieve that? Let's now come back to the demo and let me show you. This definition will not make sense as of now. Just make a note of this definition for now. I will come again and will explain it again. So as we understand that declaring this variable on global scope will solve my problem, but it is not a good approach because in that case there is a huge chance that my count variable can get reinitialized by someone else by mistake, and putting it inside will also not work. So what other thing we can do instead? I won't like initialize it inside a function because that will save my variable, but then I have to write my logic inside one more function, right? So here I will create one function, calculate maybe, and I will write my logic inside this. First of all, you need to understand like if you try to print count here and I need to call this function calculate, right? So now when I execute counter function has one more function that I am also executing. So can you see I'm able to access 0. So here also lexical scoping is working. When calculate function will work or execute, first of all it will try to find count variable within its scope. When it will not found that, it will go to its parent. So for calculate function, counter is the parent function. So in counter it will check the value of count. So it will find yes I have. So it will display it. So it means my calculate function is able to access the data defined in the counter function. So it means we are using lexical scoping here, but as of now it is not a closure yet. So closure internally use the concept of lexical scoping, but it is more than that. So closure is not same like lexical scoping. There is a confusion in between, right? So sometimes they ask like is lexical scoping is same as closure? So no. Closure use the concept of lexical scoping to implement the concept of closure. So here we can say like my calculate function is able to access the count variable which is not inside its scope. It is inside of its parent scope, but still I am able to access it. Let's check whether we are getting the result here. If I say this one and it will print 1, right? So if I call this function few more times, so do we get the result? Let's check. So can you see we are just getting 1, and the reason for that, every time when I call my counter function, definitely this statement is executing again and again, which will reset my count to 0. That's why again we are getting 1 1 1. So it means still we are not getting the result which we were expecting. So I hope now you can understand that is there any possibility like we can execute this line only once, because I want to set my counter to 0. But after that, I don't want to execute my counter function again. Instead, I want to execute this function because it is having the logic of increment the value. So in that case, instead of calling counter function again and again, is there any way I can just execute this child function? So that is the concept of closure. So in this case, all you have to do, you just need to return calculate. Now what you will do, if I do something like this, I'm executing my counter function and this counter function is returning something, but this time it is returning my child function. So here this result will not hold some value. This result instead will hold my calculate function. And now if I call result function like this, you will notice that you will get the result. So this is exactly called closure. So in this case, now let's move back to this definition. Like in JavaScript, closure is a function that references a variable in the outer scope from its inner scope. What it means? Like when your inner function references the variable from its outer scope to the inner scope. Like I'm able to access the count variable from the parent function inside this child function. The closure preserves the outer scope inside its inner scope even after outer function is returned. Now this statement is important. If you notice this one, my counter function has completed its execution at line 14, and we all know that the variable defined in a function also get garbage collected as soon as your function has completed its execution. But if you notice, my function has completed its execution here, and still when I'm executing result function is using the data that was inside my parent function, but still calculate function is able to remember the scope or the value defined in the count function, and that's all is happening because of closure and lexical scoping. So instead of this one, here you can say return count plus 1, and we can wrap it in a console.log. So let's do something console.dir that will return out all the detailed description about this one, and I will just console.dir this result variable. So I will just print this result inside it. It will not work in this one, but we can copy this code and we can use the console tab of Google Chrome because that will support this function. You can paste the code here and just try to check this function here. We have an option of scopes here. And here you can see there are multiple scope. One of the scope is closure, and the count variable that we are using, it is coming from this counter function. So if you see here, this counter function has a count, and this result function is using this count variable because of closure. So here we can see that this count is related to closure. So in simple term, now I hope you can understand, like when you define a function inside a function, and then when you return your child function still remember the data of your parent function even after your parent function has completed its execution. That is closure. So it doesn't matter how many times you will call this result function will still remember the scope of its parent function that has this count variable. Now you will ask me where exactly it is useful. The first, you can see this scenario wherever you have this kind of requirement that you want to declare a variable, but you don't want to make it available on the global scope. You want to create its own scope, private scope. Like we have a class, inside class you create your private variables, right? In JavaScript, we don't have any way to create private variables. We have either global scope or block scope. So how you can get that kind of behavior in JavaScript? So there you can use the concept of closures. Now if you want that I should not call this statement again and again, you can also get it from this one. You can even make this function an immediate invoke function that is called IIFE function. So in that case, this syntax will look more clearer. So I hope the closure concept is clear. And one more point you need to use when you use closure is the IIFE functions. IIFE is the immediate invoke function. As of now, you can see to get this result, at least I have to call this counter function once, because that counter function will give me this calculate function. So what if I wrap this counter function in a IIFE function, immediate invoke function, so that you don't need to call it like this. If you are not aware what is IIFE function, let me give you a very short example here. We know that whenever we create any function, right? Suppose I'm just printing some message here, test. This function will not execute. until unless I will not call that, right? I have to execute this function like this. So if you want that this function should call immediately or automatically, so in that case you can wrap this function into a IIFE function. IIFE function is simple. You just need to wrap it in a curly braces. So can you see that? It invoked automatically. So you just need to do something like this. Inside this, you just need to put your function call. So this syntax is called immediate invoke function or IIFE function. So you can use IIFE function with closure also. So now just to avoid this statement, I can wrap it in a IIFE function. So I can say const result, and this function execution I can wrap into IIFE function. So once I do, I don't need to write this one. You will notice automatically it is working. So this is an example of closure. So now we can say like closure are one of the most powerful feature of JavaScript, and JavaScript allows for the nesting of function and grant the inner function full access to all the variable and function defined inside the outer function. However, outer function doesn't have access to the variable and function defined inside the inner function. I think it is clear. Your calculate function can access the outer function variable, but your outer function cannot access the data or variable defined inside the inner function. If inside calculate I have some variable defined, that you cannot access in the counter function outside. Now you will ask me what benefit you will get of using this kind of pattern or behavior. So it is very straightforward, like this provides a sort of security for the variable of inner function. Also, since the inner function has access to the scope of outer function, the variables and function defined in the outer function will live longer than the outer function itself. So if the inner function managed to survive beyond the life of the outer function, a closure is created when the inner function is somehow made available to any scope outside the outer function. So if you want to just declare some variable and you don't want to make it available outside, and you want this kind of pattern, there you can use closures. This is also one real world example, but let me show you one more example where you can use closure. The behavior will remain same. Let me create a very basic HTML. Suppose I have some list of products that I want to display on my UI. I will not design any fancy UI as of now. I will just have some list here. Now what exactly I want that whenever I click on any of the product, I will create one span or div on top of this, and I want to display there how many product has been selected. Okay, so for that maybe I have one h1, and inside this I want to display how many product has been selected by the user. Maybe it's a shopping portal, right? E-commerce website. You see this behavior a lot, and I'll give some ID because I need to manipulate this DOM. And similarly, I have to add some class here also. See, there could be multiple way to do the same thing. I'm just giving you this example just to show you that where exactly the closure can use. So our HTML part is ready, right? Now what exactly I want to first grab all the elements, right? We have 4 elements and we just need to apply some loop so that we have all the element in the JavaScript, and we just need to apply some click event over there. It's a basic JavaScript, right? So first, if you want to grab all the product that we have on the page, what you will do? You will say document dot get elements by class name, because we are using class attribute and we have class name item. So what exactly it will do? If you say console.log products, it will return me 4 elements, right? Because we have 4 items inside this, so it will return me 4 elements there. So now we have the array. I just need to use loop and I just need to apply the click event on that. And now you just need to apply a click event. So how you can add a listener? So what you'll do, I will take these products of ith index and then I will use add event listener to add a event. And which event I want to have a click event that will also have its function. So now what I want, I will have one CSS class that is I will add here, maybe selected property, and I will add some basic CSS rule, nothing fancy. So I will say background color here, let me add this yellow color as a background color. And now what exactly I want, that whenever I click on any of this element, I need to check if this selected CSS, selected property or selected CSS class is already added, then remove it from there, otherwise add it, so that we can highlight my UI, that which tag or which item user has selected, right? So what you can do for that, I need to check whether that element is there or not. So for that we can say if this particular object class name has index of selected. If it has the value, it will return -1, otherwise it returns something index value, right? Otherwise else. So if it is less than 0, it means CSS class is not there for this selected class. If this condition runs, in that case selected class is not applied on this particular element. So what you will do, you will add that CSS class. How you can do? You can simply say this dot class name plus equals to selected. Otherwise, if user select on that and it found the index, then it returns to else. In that case, we need to remove this class. So we can say this dot class name and this dot class name dot replace to, what we need to replace? We need to replace selected class to empty class. So let's check whether you are getting the result or not. So when I click on this one, nothing happened. So, okay, it's CSS, right? So you should use semicolon here. Save the changes, and when I click here, you will notice we are getting the highlighted result. When you click on it again, that CSS will remove. So this is very simple logic, right? It's nothing to do with the closures. Now let's see the problem statement here is I want to display the number of product has been selected here, right? So how you can do that? Same thing, we need to initialize my count to 0 because initially no product is selected. So I need to have my counter variable which should be 0. So what we can do here, we can create one function. I can say maybe let cart counter, and I will create one function here, and that function will have a counter variable that will start with 0. This will be my selected product. So as of now, no product is selected, so it is 0. Now I want that this counter should always be 0 during the first call. Afterward, the user will click or unclick on that. Based on that, my increment and decrement should work. So in this case, I will return a object from here instead of a function. The logic will remain same. I may have some utility defined here like increment or decrement, right? So for increment, what I'll do, instead of counter, let's have count. I will increment the value by 1, and maybe I have decrement also. For decrement also, we will be having count minus equals to 1. It will be count, right? So I have two utility, increment function and decrement function. So here also we are using closure because my cart counter function is returning something that will have access to its parent data count. So here what we can do, we can create a variable cart count maybe that will call my cart counter. So at this point of time, this cart count will point to this object which will have increment and decrement. And when we execute increment and decrement, you will notice that you will be able to access the state of your count even my cart counter function has completed its execution. So that's where we are using closure. And if you want better result, you can wrap it in a IIFE function. Now you don't need to do this one. You can simply use this cart counter. Now where exactly you need to call this cart counter? So the cart counter will be an object. So increment should call when selected property will apply. So here you will say inside this if block you need to use this cart counter dot increment function, and when this statement is false, here you need to say cart counter decrement because we are decrementing it. Now whenever increment and decrement work, this count value will change. So that count we need to display on this h1 here. So for that also I can have one more function. So you can say here total count, that will simply return the value of count, whatever count is there after incrementing or decrementing. So that I can use to display it here, right? So what you can do for that, you can simply say, if I do something like this, I can say here document dot get element by ID and grab this count ID from my DOM and I want to set its inner HTML as whatever value we have in the cart counter dot value. It's total count, right? So let's understand this one. So initially we are getting 0. When you click on this one, so now whenever you do increment or decrement, you need to update. So now you will see it is displaying me 0, but when you click on this one, you will notice it is highlighting, but it will not update my HTML because this statement will execute only once. So what you have to do, you need to wrap this one also in some function which is supposed to call for every increment and decrement. So maybe I will have one function that will be update cart maybe, and this function will have this logic of updating my DOM based on the new value in my cart. So this function is supposed to call after every increment and decrement. Now let's check whether we are getting the result or not. So as of now you can say there is nothing, but because update cart function we didn't even call, it will call once we will have a click event. Okay, so as soon as I click on any of the product, you will notice it is showing me 1, 2, and if you select on any other product, it will count to 3, and when you go and unselect, it will also maintain that. So this is one of the demo that we use in e-commerce website and in a lot of other places where we have similar kind of requirement. So here the closures are very important and very useful to understand. This pattern is a kind of object oriented pattern in JavaScript, how we can create that. We have some private variable which is safe inside this block. It will not be accessible to the outside world because outside this function only increment, decrement and total count is accessible. The count variable is not accessible directly. So even you can have some internal functions also defined inside this, because whatever you do within this return keyword, that will be accessible outside this block. Otherwise all the other variables or functions that you define here will not be accessible. So this way you can implement encapsulation in JavaScript. So we have some increment, decrement and total count function which we have just used with our JavaScript logic, where have some event listener and we have just called. This is simple JavaScript code, nothing to do with closure, but I have to write that code so that I can show you some demo that based on real scenarios. So I hope the concept of closure is clear and you can come up with lots of other situation or example where closures can be useful. I found this demo makes more sense and easy to understand. In this session, I have given you this example. There could be n number of possibilities where closures can be used. So once you understand the concept of closure, you can implement it as per the requirement of your project. I hope now you understood what is closure and how it helps you in writing a better code. And that's all for today. I hope you like this video. If you liked it, don't forget to hit the like button, comment and subscribe my channel. I will see you in the next video. Till then, take care and keep learning.